projekt nam se zove Svata blata. Evo, Rio može reći nešto više o tome.
Svata blata se zove zato što ja, moj bratić i Nenad smo svi išli u vožnju s biciklima, a bilo je blatnjavo po leđima i po majici i po svemu. Je bilo hrpu malih točkica blata. I onda sljedeći dan, kada smo ja i moj bratić pričali, on je rekao, se sjećaš ono kad su bila ona sva ta blata na tvojim leđima? Pa tako smo dobili ime.
Pa nastojimo zapravo jedan drugome dati mjesta. Ja tu ne postupam kao nikakav učitelj ili kompozitor, nego baš kao nekako bendovski. I Rio meni daje njegove sugestije, ja dajem svoje sugestije. Nekad se njemu ne sviđaju moje sugestije, to je češće, a nekad meni ne pašu niti njegove. Pa onda tu malo razgovaramo i sviramo, ali uglavnom se radi o strukturiranoj improvizaciji. Imamo neke dijelove koji su nam fiksni, a onda unutar toga nekako pokušavamo komunicirati, džemati.
Da, evo imamo bend, još uvijek malo sličimo ime. Da. Za sada nam je ime Živčani slon. Ali baš trebamo se malo više dogovoriti oko toga.
Da, puno dogovoriti.
This project is endless. It's not constructing a dramaturgy, a piece, and then we go somewhere and we play. Like every single space where we are playing the concert is completely different. So that's why also we need kind of an adaptation into the space.
The main guideline is listening, right? And listening and the change in the space, right? And recontextualizing the listening of the space.
Not only our listening, but also the audience is listening, and together we listen to a space. And a space has many different forms. Every space sounds different, and it will sound different throughout the day. And just by being inside the space, it changes, and we react to that. So it's also a very reactive piece. We slowly question the space. And so there's no fixed structure because no space is fixed.
As musicians, normally we only care about sound, but forget what is happening in between. So I think it's sometimes worth to skip all the sound and try to somehow dig into what's happening in between.
Pa velikon je instrument koji je sazdan iz magneta i kalema. Ja sam sa kalemom u stvari osluškujem zvukove samih magneta. Sami magneti su u stvari izvor zvuka, kao što je žica na violini, tako je ovdje magnet i mogućnosti su skoro pa beskonačne. Ali upravo zbog toga što imam dva kalema u rukama, ja u stvari se krećem u tom magnetnom polju i konstantno menjam zvuk samih magneta. Tako da nije samo zvuk tog trenja, vibriranja samog objekta, već i magnetno polje koje je okruženo oko njega. Tako sa tim se u stvari bavim i to oblikujem. Ono što me zaista privuklo je taj otklanjanje od zvuka, od tradicije, odnosno beskonačni prostor novih mogućnosti koje na neki način zbog velike tradicije koje svaki instrument i muzika sa njom nosi, ostavlja manje prostora. Tako da je ovo prosto jedan veliki prostor novih mogućnosti.
It started with a practice where I was listening to the electromagnetic activity of the venues where I was going to perform. Started with a building that has like a very strong building in New York called Knockdown Center that had a very strong radio presence and electromagnetic activity. That was interfering with everything that I was doing, so I decided to use all that as a material for the piece. And then that became a practice where I would listen to the electromagnetic activity of buildings and composes the piece out of that. And when I was doing that for one building in New York, they had a 3D printer in the space, and when I listened to it through the different devices that I was listening to, I was amazed by the sound, and I decided to build my own 3D printer to be able to really get into the sound and be able to interact with other, improvise with other musicians around the different tonalities, timbre qualities, rhythms.
There's sound parameters which are meeting points for both, and one of them is rhythm, one of them is pitch, like really very simple musical parameters. And so I basically like to fetch Annette's pitches and turn them into more like tonal landscapes through the violin and through the voice, which emphasizes already a pitch that exists, so it becomes this really nice textural blend, I find. And also it's similar with rhythmical patterns, which of course are not intended as a rhythmical pattern, but I perceive them like this, and then I emphasize them or work with them or oppose them, or however I decide to work with this. So it's like a dialogue.
The piece is inspired by an encounter with a Neolithic temple called the Halsafina Hypogeum in Malta. And specifically, when I visited this temple, I was struck by the resonant frequencies, which, when you stand in certain parts of the temple, and there are two voices that sound at the same time at the 114 hertz and 70 hertz, then it causes physiological sensations.
If you kind of delete or cancel one sense, you have to focus more on the one sense that is still there. So you can just deep more into the hearing and in the listening process, I would say. And also I think the darkness somehow creates a very, a focused atmosphere also. So you can just dive into it and let the sound just crash on. For me, actually, water is a really basic element which is always somehow present, and also water has a really intense political dimension. When you can look at it on several levels, I guess, and that's why I used it. And it brings a lot of tension and a lot of narrative, actually, in the first place to the piece.
Yeah, so the piece I'm presenting is called Desire Paths, and desire paths refer to this idea of a human-made or non-human, because animals make them too, a path that isn't like the prescribed path. So if you're in a park and you have like the paving, but then you always see these lines of earth where people are like, no, but this is like the more direct way, or I want to go this way. Desire paths are not necessarily the easiest way. Often they'll like go up a weird hill or something like this. So it's not about like ease, but I think there's something very interesting to me about the idea of repetition of the same trajectory or path becoming a kind of mark making that changes a landscape. And with the desire path, I'm also really interested in the sense that it's a collective activity that doesn't happen at the same time. So there's like a displacement in time, but sort of something about a collective intuition that like, this is the way. So this piece kind of works a lot, I guess, with the idea of like reiteration of the same material, that then becomes like a mass that sort of changes something. And I'm interested in this also in terms of like as a concept that is explored a lot in like urban theory or architectural theory, about a kind of resistance to prescribed structures that come from like a hierarchical or organization standpoint. And it's kind of, for me, it's like a very intriguing kind of active collective resistance against larger fixed structures.
I'm very interested in the perception of the world around us. I mean, how an individual can perceive things which are around him or them. It's a contemporary question because we are all the time confronted with different kinds of perception and different kinds of information that we get. Most of them, a lot of them are coming from devices which are not necessarily natural or part of an environment. And what I wanted to do is create something which I cannot do with live performers, because there needed to be a reason to do it with loudspeakers. So what I did is I took every sound of the drums, which are normally played together by one individual, and I spread them all around the space, thus creating a forest of sound. And some you will hear once and then hear a second time much later and then remember it. Some come quite often, some come from there, some come from here. It's a landscape, really. And so I had to record one sound after the other, a lot of sounds, of course, and then I just spread them through the space. That was it.
So as a director of GRM, GRM is partner of KONTEJNER, actually through this network Reimagine Europe. So we've been exchanging a lot with curator Davorka Begovic around lots of different projects actually, and some project that's been presented to this festival have been also presented in Paris with GRM. So it's a kind of exchange, ongoing exchange with KONTEJNER.
The people working there are comprehensive of any kind of creation process. You can come there with any knowledge of whatsoever, and they will understand it and make it into a project that makes sense in the continuity of the history of the GRM.
I came with two projects actually. Two projects I did with a videographer, cinematographer, Eleonore Wyss. The first is more Eleonore's project. It's a movie, documentary about Eliane Radig, who is a French composer, a great composer and a great friend of us. So the idea was to really go back to this intimacy, and because we're friends and we can talk casually with her, the idea was to just have a conversation, and Eleonore was around with the camera, and since she's a friend too, it didn't feel like an intrusion. It was important for us to be in this very bubble style environment. And actually the documentary doesn't show so much of Eliane. She's here, she's present in the movie, but in fragmental way, and it's more that everything that she's evoking and that she's her imagination, references that Eleonore shoot afterwards in order to illustrate really a philosophy of composing, and which is almost a philosophy of life. The second project is a AV project called Shifting in Dreams, Redreamed. And it's taken from my previous album under the project Kasseljäger that was called Shifted in Dreams. And Eleonore built a movie listening to the album. And when she finished, I watched the movie and I recreate a new soundtrack with elements from the album. So it's kind of a dream on a dream on a dream.
Načelna ideja je bila da se testiraju granice klasičnog gitarskog amplificiranog kvarteta.
Da, tu postoji ta estetika i možda i stav rock'n'rolla, jer svi smo iz toga izašli, jer je to osnova tog instrumenta, ajmo reći, i možda čak i onda takvog nekog sastava.
Koliko ta forma koju, pogotovo u zadnjih 20 godina, se smatra često i opravdano, anakronom, potrošenom i tako dalje, koliko ona kao takva može još pružiti. Mi ćemo svirati taj repertoar koji je snimljen na albumu, koji će izaći za Kopaton Records.
To je jedan od bitnijih trenutaka u hrvatskoj glazbenoj povijesti i možda čak i za ovu regiju da se dešava nešto takvo.
Jer nema potencijalnih nesporazuma u komunikaciji. Ako postoji specijaliziran label za muziku koja je apstraktnije prirode, znaš da ćeš se javiti njima.
Scena se dramatično razvija. Jako je puno mladih ljudi sa otvorenim pogledima koje stalo na scenu, došlo na scenu, pristupilo sceni, odlučilo sudjelovati. Mislim, ovakve scene se baziraju prvenstveno na želji, volji i entuzijazmu pojedinaca.
So I made Tipping Point 10 years ago, and it was commissioned by an organisation called Cryptic in Glasgow for their festival Sonica. And then it's been touring to quite a lot of different places ever since. So I'm really thrilled to bring it to Kontejner in Zagreb for its 10-year anniversary. The installation works with audio feedback. So inside each glass vessel there's a microphone and an LED, and then external to the glasses there's some speakers. And it's routed so that the microphone is fed into the speaker. And I work with a software programmer called Matthew Olden, who's made a system where the feedback is just balancing on its tipping point. So again, feedback has got this ability to race out of control, a bit like climate tipping points. So I was interested to use audio feedback to make the sound. So it's balancing on its tipping point, and it's just starting to feed back. And the water inside the glass vessel, the water level, it tunes the feedback to different pitches because it changes the amount of space in the glass vessel. So in that way it works like a lot of different musical instruments like organ pipes or just blowing over the top of a bottle with water in. So that's how it's tuned. And the nice thing about it as well is that because there's a bit of instability with feedback, it sometimes gets suddenly louder and softer, and you get these kind of pulsing effects. And that inspired me to also use a light inside each tube so that when the sound gets louder, the light gets brighter, and it kind of draws attention to this unstable nature of the feedback. But also not all the tubes are resonating at the same time, so the light kind of draws attention to which ones are sounding. When I started making the piece, I was also really keen to make a piece that I could also perform live with. So all along I was thinking about how it could also be a musical instrument that I could perform with. So when I do the live performance, I can control the motors live, and I can switch the microphones on and off, so I can select which tubes are resonating. And by controlling the motors, I can kind of fill and empty them in a more controlled way. And then with the feedback that's happening locally with the small speaker, I can choose to send the sound of any of them into a mixing desk that I then use some effects pedals, like a pitch shift and a distortion and a reverb, that then goes to a bigger PA with also a sub. So I've got a much broader dynamic range and frequency range to play with. Another thought about performing with this piece for longer durations, or thinking about the installation constantly changing, I'm interested in creating work that brings people into a space where they might slow down and listen and become immersed in a sound, or obviously there's a visual experience as well, but to sort of spend time with that for longer periods of time. For many reasons, really, because often technology is associated with things speeding up, doing things really fast and being very efficient. So with the sound moving very slowly and the piece having this kind of delicate quality, I sort of do want to bring people into a space where you might listen for longer periods of time and start to listen in more detail. And yeah, think about longer time periods. So I'm very interested in artists like Elaine Radig and Pauline Oliveros, and thinking about deep listening and listening for longer periods of time also maybe relates to thinking about geological time frames that are outside a kind of human frame of reference, which are important things to contemplate when we do think about things like climate change, and also our place on the planet, which in terms of time is very tiny and small, and we're having this sort of big effect on the planet. So all of those things are kind of in my mind when thinking about this piece and the sound and the performance.